African American poetry, not even only these days. I mean, if you look at the work, I'm going to pick some people totally off the top of my head. You know, Tracy K. Smith, Marilyn Nelson, Nikki Finney, and Natasha Trethewey, let's say. Those are four African American women poets. And their work, you would simply never mistake the work of one for the other if you looked at it on the paper. You just wouldn't. They're talking about different things. They're speaking out of different regions in the country, different subject matters, different sets of concerns, different kinds of language, different responses to formalism, different ears. So, you know, to really emphasize all that is quite distinct in African American poetry is important, so that we don't get in our head that it is one thing. On the other hand, is the African American musical tradition and the African American oral tradition a tremendous, tremendous resource for a poet to call upon? Absolutely. In my own work, what I'm interested in is keeping all my ears, not just the two of them, you know, keeping every ear open to all there is to bring into the work. And some of that listening is something that any poet can do. You know, anybody can listen. Anybody can, you know, I'm not a jazz musician, and though I consider it an African American tradition with some very brilliant practitioners who are not African American, but nonetheless an African American tradition, it's not anything that I know how to do, but does that affect my work? Well, yes, because I've taken it, because it's great. So it teaches me something in the same way that a Shakespearean sonnet, because it's great, teaches me something. And so, you know, the poetics that emerge is sort of quite an amalgam of a lot of different sources. I do think, you know, when you think about even in families that are in some ways maybe further away from the really, really richest iterations of an oral tradition, nonetheless, I think that, for example, aphorisms in African American culture are a very, very powerful poetic resource. And just that sense of kind of the pithy and proverbial, which I think of as a poetics, and that is something that maybe that's something that you hear grandmothers saying. But again, whether or not we choose to draw on it depends on the poet. I would start with the influence that poetry's had on hip hop, just as far as, you know, putting things in historical order. And that, you know, when hip hop emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was coming out of many traditions and many sets of circumstances, but the oral tradition of toasting, right, of toasting and boasting and roasting, that's a part of the Black tradition, that sort of getting up and playing the dozens, you know, all of those competitive verbal traditions are totally, especially in early hip hop, just all over the place. And so, you know, that's a poetic resource, certainly. The way also that hip hop is so elusive, that, you know, in sampling there are a million references. The intertextuality of hip hop, I think, even when it's not necessarily borrowing from written poetry, is something that feels like literary activity to me in many ways. But then to look at the influence from the other side, I think there are a lot of people, probably a little bit younger than I am, who really, 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 really came up in the hip hop era. I mean, you know, knowing nothing else or knowing other things, but that hip hop was always there. You know, I remember when my tastes were formed when it wasn't there. So I watched with interest and listened as it emerged. But I think for people for whom it was always there, that's certainly that sense of rhythm and rhyme, and again, sort of the public boast as an art form.